Chapter 18. The Must Not Waste No Time. Of course, Mary did not waken early the next morning. She slept late because she was tired, and when Martha brought her breakfast, she told her that though Colin was quite quiet, he was ill and feverish as he always was after he'd worn himself out with a fit of crying. Mary ate her breakfast slowly as she listened. "He says he wishes thou would please go and see him as soon as thou can," Martha said. "It's strange what a fancy he's took to thee. Thou did give it to him last night for sure, didn't thou? Nobody else would have dared to do it. Poor lad, he's been spoiled till salt won't save him. Mother says two things are the worst that can happen to a child. It's to never have his own way or to always have it. She doesn't know which one is the worst. Thou was in a fine temper thyself too. But he says to me when I went on into his room, he says, 'Please ask Miss Mary if she'll please come and talk to me.' Think of him saying please. Will you go, miss?" "I'll run and I'll go see Deacon first," said Mary. "Well, no, I'll go and see Colin first and I'll tell him." "I know what I'll tell him," she said with sudden inspiration. She had her hat on when she appeared in Colin's room, and for a second he looked disappointed. He was in bed, and his face was pitifully white, and there were dark circles around his eyes. "I'm glad you came," he said. "My head aches, and I ache all over because I'm so tired. Are you going somewhere?" Mary went and leaned against his bed. "I won't be long," she said. "I'm going to Deacon, but I'll come back. Colin, it's something about the garden." His whole face brightened, and a little color came into it. "Oh, is it?" he cried out. "I dreamed about it all night. I heard you say something about gray changing into green, and I dreamed I was standing in a place all filled with trembling little leaves, and there were birds on nests everywhere, and they looked so soft and still. I'll lie and I'll think about that until you come back." In 5 minutes, Mary was with Deacon in their garden. The fox and the crow were with him again, and this time he had brought 2 squirrels. "I came over on the pony this morning," he said. He's a good little chap, Jump is. I brought these 2 in my pockets. This here one's called Nut, and this other one is called Shell." When he said Nut, one squirrel leaped onto his right shoulder, and when he said Shell, the other one leaped onto his left. When they sat down on the grass with Captain curled at their feet, Soot solemnly listening on a tree, and Nut and Shell nosing about close to them, it seemed to Mary that it would be scarcely bearable to leave such delightfulness. But when she began to tell her story, somehow the look in Deacon's funny face gradually changed her mind. She could see he felt sorrier for Colin than she did. He looked up at the sky and he looked all around him and said, "Just listen to them birds. The world seems full of 'em, all whistling and piping," he said. "Look at 'em darting about and heartening at 'em and calling to each other. Come springtime, it seems like the whole world is calling to each other. The leaves is uncurling so you can see 'em, and as my word, the nice smells that they're all about." And he sniffed with his happy turned-up nose. "And that poor lad is lying there shut up and seeing so little that he gets to thinking of things that sets him to screaming. We mun get him out of here. We mun get him watching and listening and sniffing up the air and get him just soaked through with sunshine. And we mun not lose no time about it." When he was very much interested, he often spoke quite broad Yorkshire, though at times he tried to modify his dialect so that Mary could understand him better. But she loved his broad Yorkshire and had, in fact, been trying to learn to speak it herself, so she spoke a little now. "Aye, that we mun," she said, which meant yes, indeed we must. "I'll tell thee what us'll do first," she proceeded, and Deacon grinned, because when the little wench tried to twist her tongue into speaking Yorkshire, it amused him very much. "He's took a greatly fancy to thee. He wants to see thee, and he wants to see Soot and Cap'n. When I go back to the house, I'll talk to him, and I'll ask him if thou cannot come and see him tomorrow morning, and bring the creatures with thee. And then, in a bit, when there's more leaves out, and happen a bud or two, we'll get him to come, and thou shalt push him in his chair, and we'll bring him here, and we'll show him everything." And when she stopped, she was quite proud of herself. She had never made such a long speech in Yorkshire before, and she had remembered very well. "Thou mun talk a bit of Yorkshire like that to Master Colin," Deacon chuckled. "That'll make him laugh. And there's nowt as good for ill folks' laughing. Mother says she believes as half an hour's good laugh every morning would cure a chap was making ready for the typhus fever." "I'm going to talk Yorkshire to him this very day," said Mary, chuckling to herself. The garden had reached that time of year when every day and every night it seemed as if magicians were passing through it, drawing loveliness out of the earth and the boughs with wands. It was hard to go away and leave it all, particularly as Nut had actually crept onto her dress, and Shell had scrambled down the trunk of the apple tree, and they sat under, and he stayed there, looking at her with inquiring eyes. But she went back to the house, and when she sat down close to Colin's bed, he began to sniff, as Deacon did, though not in such an experienced way. You smell like flowers and fresh things," he cried out quite joyously. "What is it you smell of? It's cool and warm and sweet all at the same time." "It's the wind from the moor," said Mary. "It comes a-sitting on the grass under the tree with Deacon and Cap'n and Soot and Nut and Shell. It's the springtime, and it's out of doors, and it's sunshines, and it smells so greatily." She said it as broadly as she could, and you do not know how broadly Yorkshire sounds until you've heard someone speak it. Colin began to laugh. "What are you doing?" he said. "I've never heard you talk like that before. How funny it sounds." "I'm giving thee a bit of Yorkshire," answered Mary triumphantly. "I cannot talk as greatly as Deacon and Martha, but thou can see I can shape a bit. Doesn't thou understand a bit of Yorkshire when thou hears it? And thou a Yorkshire lad thyself, born and bred. I wonder thou art not ashamed of thy face." And then she began to laugh too, and they both laughed until they could not stop themselves. And they laughed until the room echoed, and Mrs. Medlock opened the door to come in and drew back into the corridor and stood listening, amazed. "Well, upon my word," she said, speaking rather broad Yorkshire herself, because there was no one there to hear her, and she was so astonished. "Who ever heard the like? Who ever on earth would have thought it?" There was so much to talk about. It seemed as if Colin could never hear enough of Deacon and Cap'n and Soot and Nut and Shell and the pony whose name was Jump. Mary had to run round into the wood with Deacon to see Jump. He was a tiny little shaggy moor pony with thick locks hanging over his eyes, and a pretty face and a nuzzling velvet nose. He was rather thin with living on the moor grass, but he was as tough and wiry as if the muscles in his little legs had been made of steel springs. He had lifted his head and whinnied softly the moment he saw Deacon, and he had trotted up to him and he'd put his head across his shoulder, and then Deacon had talked into his ear and Jump had talked back in odd little whinnies and puffs and snorts. Deacon had made him give Mary his small front hoof and then kiss her on the cheek with his velvet muzzle. "Does he really understand everything Deacon says?" Colin asked. "Well, it seems as if he does," answered Mary. "Deacon says anything will understand if you're friends with it for sure. But you have to be friends for sure." Colin lay quiet a little while, and his strange gray eyes seemed to be staring at the wall, but Mary saw that he was actually thinking. I wish I was friends with things, he said at last, but I'm not. I've never had anything to be friends with, and I can't bear people. Well, can't you bear me? Asked Mary. Yes, I can, he answered. It's funny, but I even like you. Ben Weatherstaff said I was like him, said Mary. He said he'd warrant that we'd both got the same nasty tempers, and I think you're like him too. We are all three alike, you and I and Ben Weatherstaff. He said we are neither of us much to look at, and we are as sour as we looked. But I don't feel as sour as I used to before I knew the Robin and Deacon. Did you feel as if you hated people? Yes, answered Mary without any affectation. I should have detested you if I had seen you before I saw the Robin and Deacon. Colin put out his thin hand and touched her. Mary, he said, I wish I hadn't said what I did about sending Deacon away. I hated you when you said he was like an angel, and I laughed at you, but perhaps he is. Well, it was rather funny to say it, she admitted frankly, because his nose does turn up, and he does have a big mouth, and his clothes all have patches all over 'em, and he talks broad Yorkshire, but if an angel did come to Yorkshire and live on the moor, if there was a Yorkshire angel, I believe he'd understand the green things and know how to make them grow, and he would know how to talk to the wild creatures as Deacon does, and they'd know that he was friends for sure. I shouldn't mind Deacon looking at me, said Colin. I want to see him. Oh, I'm glad you said that, answered Mary, because, and quite suddenly it came into her mind that this was the minute to tell him, and Colin knew something was coming. Because of what? He cried eagerly. Mary was so anxious that she got up from her stool and she came and she caught hold of both of his hands. Can I trust you? I trusted Deacon because birds trusted him. Can I trust you? For sure. For sure? She implored him. Her face was so solemn that he almost whispered his answer. Yes, yes. Well, Deacon will come and see you tomorrow morning, and he'll bring his creatures with him. Oh, oh, Colin cried out in delight. But that's not all, Mary went on, almost pale with solemn excitement. The rest is better. There is a door into the garden. I found it. It is under the ivy on the wall. If he had been a strong and healthy boy, Colin would have probably shouted, Hooray, hooray! But he was weak and rather hysterical. His eyes grew bigger and bigger, and he gasped for breath. Oh, Mary, he cried out with half a sob, shall I see it? Shall I go into it? Shall I live to get into it? And he clutched her hands and he dragged her towards him. Of course you'll see it, she said with indignantly. Of course you'll live to get into it. Don't be silly now. And she was so unhysterical and natural and childish that she brought him to his senses, and he began to laugh at himself. In a few minutes afterwards, she was sitting on her stool again, telling him not what she imagined the secret garden to be like, but what it really was. And Colin's aches and tiredness were forgotten, and he was listening enraptured. It is just what you thought it would be, he said at last. It sounds as if you had really seen it. You know, I said that when you first told me. Mary hesitated about 2 minutes and then boldly spoke the truth. I had seen it. I had been in, she said. I found the key and I got in weeks ago. But I daren't tell you. I daren't because I was so afraid I couldn't trust you. For sure.